Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Caleb Weiss. He's a senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Today, we're going to take a little diversion from our coverage of the situation with Hamas and Israel and the militias and all of that mess in the Middle East that's broken out. We're going to take a turn to Al-Qaeda. The reason we're going to pivot to Al-Qaeda is that our guest today, her name is Sara Harmouch. She is a senior PhD candidate at American University and founder and CEO of H9 Defense. Sara recently wrote a fantastic article at War on the Rocks. It's titled Al-Qaeda, a Defeated Threat? Think Again. I don't think listeners are going to be shocked that this is the kind of analysis that gets Caleb and I, gets our ears up. It tracks with what we've been reporting about Al-Qaeda and, all of the D words that have been attributed to it, decimated, degraded, defeated, done, go on and on. I forget all the D words. There's so many of them. But Sara's here today, of course, to discuss that article in depth and discuss Al-Qaeda's remaining threat more generally, as well as a little bit more about her background and research interests. Sara, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thank you so much, Bill and Caleb, for having me. I really appreciate it. And we're going to dive into Al-Qaeda's threat and its remaining resilience and adaptability and ongoing threats to the United States and its allies.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, so before we jump into that, Sara, you're a PhD candidate at American University. You have your own security consulting firm, and congratulations. Introduce yourself to the audience more properly. Tell us about your background, your research interests, your dissertation topic, what you mainly study, and anything else that you think would be relevant for us to get to know you better.
Sure, will do. So I grew up originally in the Middle East. I grew up in Lebanon for the first, 15, 16 years of my life. And I've witnessed a lot of the things that right now I work against, from terrorism to corruption to wars to conflicts. And that, left me with, wanting to help eradicate or, help not have the problem of, terrorism or other people or, children who are going to be facing similar things that I faced as a child. So, I started my journey in the US and I ended up, I got my first master's at Georgia Tech, my second one at Daniel Morgan Graduate School, which is now Texas A&M's Bush School. Both, all my graduate degrees have been in international relations, science and technology, and also delving into intelligence analysis. And I ended up, doing research for multiple think tanks in DC. And then right now I consult for the U.S. government and the private sector on counterterrorism and conflict and geopolitical warfares. And I'm continuously right now. Yes, I'm getting my PhD at American University. My dissertation topic looks at resolve when it comes to militant groups. There's been a lot of conversations on resilience and resolve and all of these factors when it comes to state actors and their ability to sustain and wars and turning the tides and all of these things. So I'm looking at now to look into resolve when it comes to militant groups and how it is this factor of resolve that often turn the tides and often leads militant groups to either conduct international or domestic attacks, or even, sustain and continue to adapt and remain resilient and, bounce back after many years of counterterrorism pressure in order for us to understand the capabilities aspect of militant groups even more. Because right now we mainly look at either intentions, ideology, or even material resources, which there's been, evidence and research on both that's, contested, not linear. So my dissertation tries to assess militant groups' resolve and how that influences militant groups' choice of conducting international or domestic attacks, as now more so militant groups and non-state actors are becoming more relevant in the global sphere, and especially with proxy wars and all of that. So we're able to continuously be prepared for emerging threats.
That's fascinating. That's one of the things, the resolve issue is something that certainly I felt has always been in our enemy's advantage. The Taliban, or it's saying that's attributed to the Taliban. I've heard it elsewhere. The Taliban says we have all the clocks and they have all the time. I always say that we operate in terms of election cycles, 2 and 4 years, where these groups operate in terms of decades and generations. And I think that is one of the key. That's how they're thinking. They understand that they're under the underdog and they weather these blows. So that I'm very interested in seeing how your research, what you come up with in your research on that with your dissertation. So congratulations.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been an exciting journey to, be able to come up with this variable and see how it's going to unfold and, what are the statistical analyses on it and its influence on militant group strategies and tactics.
And I think when you pair, I don't want to get too far off topic here, but when you pair up resolve with their ideology, which leads them to believe that they have, they have a religious motivation to do that they ultimately they're destined. You pair those two factors up. They know that they're weaker in us in material and in fundraising and things of that nature. But I do believe those are two very big advantages. Their resolve and their religious motivations to continue these wars. I think those two really fuse together to give them a strong foundation to continue the fight.
No, and I definitely agree on that aspect. And I do think, I'm leaving ideology out of my research for I'm, using it as a control variable just because there's been a lot of contested, again, research and evidence on the role of ideology in their motivations. I think it's used as a recruitment tool, as propaganda, as a factor that unites members together, not as a specific literal interpretation of the ideology itself or the religion itself. But I do think it plays a role. And, seeing how my dissertation is going to unfold, I will be pairing them together at some point to just see if ideology sways resolve or even impacts their tactics and strategies even more than just resolve by itself. But just like you said, we rely a lot on material resources, and in our fight, even when we conduct counterterrorism operations, we look at things from a financial lens. While, these groups don't really, think they need the money, they also operate, efficiently, and they've had successful operations without the need of so much money or so much resources. So you're right on that aspect that, they're, adaptable, and they continue to be committed and motivated. And, even 20 years later, and right now, after 20 years, of, the global war on terror and being in Afghanistan, they're still there, and they're, being, reinvigorated. They reiterate their commitment many times over the past, 2 years after we withdrew from Afghanistan. So they definitely continue to be a threat even then, when they don't have the advantages that we have, as all the resources and everything we come with.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn to your recent article, The War on the Rocks. So you begin your article correctly noting that President Biden's triumphant statement on Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan was about a month and a half ago, where he denied that Al-Qaeda is even in Afghanistan and intimated that the Taliban helped us eliminate them. That statement, of course, is false. I believe there's a lot of evidence to the contrary of this. This is something we've, here at the Long War Journal have been sounding the alarm on since the fall of Afghanistan in 2021. So let's talk more about how do you see Al-Qaeda's current presence in Afghanistan? There's been reporting from the United Nations on training camps. There's reporting on previously imprisoned commanders such as Abu Ikhlas al-Masri. He's back into the fight. The Haqqani network, which is, of course, is an arm of the Taliban, or a branch of the Taliban, issuing documents, passports, and national ID cards for Al-Qaeda. The involvement of Central Asian jihadist groups. Talk to us about what you see Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan is. How strong are they in your estimation? And what evidence do you see that refutes President Biden's statement that Al-Qaeda is done in Afghanistan?
Well, to be honest, Bill, even after we withdrew from Afghanistan, many generals made statements and, congressional hearings were held. And all of, the generals reiterated, like, it's going to take 1 to 2 years for Al-Qaeda to rebuild. It's, we're going to see them resurging. We don't know, right now what their capabilities are, but, they are going to continue to want to attack the United States. Right now, even right at, the minute we withdrew from Afghanistan and Taliban took over, you can see a lot of the commanders of Al-Qaeda and some members of Al-Qaeda, strolled back in with cars and members into Afghanistan, where they've been off the map and off the grid for the past, 14, 15 years. Between one of them, Muhammad Amin al-Haq Sam Khan, who is in the Blackguard unit of bin Laden, and he was really close and he's been off the grid for the past 14 years, but then he was, coming back. And you can also see that, the training camps are back, especially in areas once, earmarked by bin Laden that they were crucial for Al-Qaeda and its operations. Not only that, even in 2021 in September, right after we withdrew and, the United Nations reported that there are 8,000 to 10,000 foreign fighters that remain in Afghanistan and, within Al-Qaeda's ranks. And while, President Biden mentions all the time, like, we are working with the Taliban is not, they're going to help us. But the Taliban has always been one of the strongest allies of Al-Qaeda. Even we can go back to the times where, bin Laden was still there, and reading all their publications and their books. And I, understand the skepticism in believing everything they say and they write. But, bin Laden said that he was going to conduct, an attack, and he followed up with his words. So we might want to, again, look at what they say and, while take it with a grain of salt, but we should really assess, the validity of these threats. And, reading all these like documents and even the declassified ODNI documents of all the, bin Laden documents, reading through them and, going over all of their statements and publications, even before conducting 9/11, bin Laden had to run the 9/11 attack by Mullah Omar at the time. And he was awaiting approval for Mullah Omar, which tells you how much the Taliban has, the links and, the ties between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Not only that, bin Laden, you can see Al-Qaeda groups and Al-Qaeda, affiliates leaders always pledging allegiance to bin Laden. And the one only time that, I've read or seen bin Laden had pledged allegiance was to Mullah Omar, which means the Taliban, which also tells you, regardless when you give a pledge, even though the affiliates leaders of Al-Qaeda pledged allegiance to bin Laden's pledge to Taliban tells you it's, right there that also all of the affiliates and all of that are still tied to Taliban. And, and even as Taliban tries to get recognition, yes, they're telling Al-Qaeda, like, do not conduct any attacks from Afghanistan, which, we've seen statements of Al-Qaeda saying that, like, we're not going to conduct attacks from Afghanistan. But that does not mean the training camps are not, going to continue. That does not mean the routes, the operations, the planning of it is going to be from there. And it's just, I do think sometimes it's a smoke screen just for Taliban to get the recognition it wants. But Al-Qaeda's threat remains from there. And right now, the training camps, the foreign fighters, the Taliban, doing and conducting, the way on its citizens and all of that going back to Sharia law, that shows you that these times are reminiscent of the past of Taliban pre 9/11, which again, the suicide bombing camps, the training, all of that is back. Not only that, but the Al-Qaeda we know today is not the same Al-Qaeda that we've known before 9/11. The Al-Qaeda today has learned, it has adapted, it has changed its strategies, and you can track and, look at the patterns and trends of their strategic differences and their strategic adaptations from before 9/11 up until today. And you can see how, they're becoming more covert in their planning. They are not announcing leaders anymore because, the bin Laden documents and even all the books emphasize how, they were worried about drones and leadership decapitation, and they want to preserve the core. And, the recent Al-Qaeda statements say that there are even 9/11 veterans within Al-Qaeda's core right now and within Al-Qaeda's branches. So you still have, members who helped plan / conduct / facilitate 9/11 right now, training and educating generations of, new jihadists. And, the way the US exited from Afghanistan, it created also a lot of probably militants and more extremists for generations to come that felt that the US betrayed them and left them under the siege of Taliban, which again brings anti-US sentiment, and Al-Qaeda feeds off of that rhetoric. So, I mean, even looking just in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda is back. And while it's not announcing it like it used to, and it's not making it public, and we're not seeing visible activities, that does not mean, the absence of evidence does not mean the evidence is absent. They're going to continue, but they're doing it on their own way and their own terms and quietly, because they love the element of surprise. And that's when we are mostly shocked by an attack. And as we focus, and shift our strategies, elsewhere, this is the time where most planning and most, organizing and all of that starts to occur. So, it's still there. And I do think President Biden is slowly starting to see that and, rescind his statement of they're gone and they're not there. And I mean, and like, I mentioned in my article, the latest FBI arrest in Philadelphia tied to Al-Qaeda with weapons of mass destruction, which, right now, even within like the media and the rhetoric, we can't even put the word nuclear next to terrorism because it's just such, and not, we don't want to believe that this actual threat exists, because how can you deter a terrorist group that's willing to die for its cause from using such weapons?
You had mentioned the generals had said, there's a resurgence of Al-Qaeda. This is one of the things I've always refuted it. We were able to document based on open source information alone that Al-Qaeda had a significant presence in Afghanistan during the as the U.S. was still in Afghanistan all the way up to the withdrawal date. I mean, I've seen top Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives and military commanders, other financiers were being killed or captured on a consistent basis. So that's always stuck in my craw. And then the reports come out after, and this was last summer, from the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions and Monitoring Team about training camps and safe houses and even a media operations center. And the Biden administration came out and rejected this. It refuted the information that was put out by the United Nations Security Council. I found this to be quite odd. Do you have any insight as to why the administration would come out and really just trash the work of the sanctions and monitoring team, which has really been excellent over the years? I mean, they've gotten very, very little wrong. Some minor details often. And sometimes it's the way the information comes to them. The capture, I remember, of an Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula leader, they didn't get that right. But, these are few and far between. Their trends and their analysis have been really as good as it gets out there.
No, I completely agree with you. And the UN's reporting has always been so great. And like you said, it always gets better. And they have, I've read almost all of the reporting every time they issue new reports. I do think the administration, after 20 years of being in Afghanistan, the appetite, the heat that the administration has gotten over the way we exited from Afghanistan. And, at first it was like, we'll do it over a year, and then it was 6 months, and then it was 3 months, and then it was a month. So it's just, the US does not have the appetite to go into Afghanistan again, or to even acknowledge that the threat still exists. So there is no, wonder why, the Biden administration would refuse and reject everything the monitoring team has put together, because they don't want to believe that the threat actually exists, or that, after 20 years of war in Afghanistan, it did not really accomplish much. Yes, we've killed many Al-Qaeda leaders and members and all of that, but the threat is still there. And, and as we, start going closer to election cycles, and even the American populist does not have the appetite to be like, okay, we're going to be, sending more troops to Afghanistan. We're back in the Middle East. And as we focus right now and shift to China and Russia and Ukraine, ironically, now we're back in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas. Any type of reporting that's going to say, oh, there's a threat, it's going to shift from the administration's focus off of Russia and China and Ukraine. And then even with Congress's money or bills and all of that. And the administration does not want that. And especially as, we're coming close to elections and the populace is just, there's no appetite for that. So, regardless if the administration rejects it or not, the reality is they are in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda is still there. Whether we go back, we decide to try to, build a strategy that addresses all threats, mutually inclusive rather than shifting between like great power competition and, counterterrorism. We need to continuously be vigilant about the terrorism threat. And I mean, Hamas's resurgence is by itself the evidence of, they were quiet for so many years and we shifted our focus. Our focus for the past 20 years have always just been on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Hamas was not in the picture. And suddenly the attack comes by and, terrorism is back and they were quiet. So if that doesn't tell us that we should continuously be vigilant and if we just turn our eyes off the ball, the ball will come and, hit really strong, just like Hamas did. And then we're surprised and then we have to shift our priorities. So I do think it's just the Biden administration does not want to believe that the threat is there, does not want to have to shift its priorities. It does not want to, the word Afghanistan after the withdrawal, it was just, you couldn't even publish anything on terrorism related, in the media because the focus was just China, Russia, Ukraine. So it's just, I think the West is tired. So is its people. But even if we're, tired and weary and we've been in conflicts for decades, us not being vigilant, it will cost us another 20 years or 30 years, soon in the future because of this mistake.
Yeah, Sarah, what you're describing there is they made a political decision to ignore intelligence of Al-Qaeda being in Afghanistan. And this is very, very dangerous for the future. This is, I believe, how we got into the problems of 9/11. It was the Clinton administration thought it could be managed, that Al-Qaeda wasn't a serious threat, even though there were several significant attacks. And, you also said something very, which I agree with. Washington is unable to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, Al-Qaeda can be a threat from Afghanistan. And hey, maybe, we could have argued that we were going to leave Afghanistan and been honest about what we were leaving behind and then said, well, we were going to manage this the best we can. We've done all we can. But what was done here, we were sold a bad bill of goods, that Al-Qaeda was no longer a threat from Afghanistan. The Taliban is our ally. This really can set us up something very dangerous. And so Caleb, you had a question for Sarah?
Not on this, but I'd like to move away from your favorite topic of Afghanistan.
Oh, thank you, Caleb, for saving me. Thank you.
I'll save the listeners the trouble. But yeah, so one thing I think is interesting is that in defending your piece from some of the naysayers, or what we like to call the denialists, on Twitter, or what is now X, you tweeted, "It," being the article, "views AQ and its affiliates as a unified network, arguing that the activities of its affiliates reflect and often directly contribute to the overarching goals and strategies of the core group." This is exactly, this gets Al-Qaeda exactly right. And it's something that Bill and I, especially me, have been arguing online on Twitter for years. And just a lot of the denialists, or what our colleague Tom Jocelyn calls, disconnecting the dots. They kind of like to put this false divide between, the so-called core, or what Al-Qaeda calls its general command, and, its affiliates or branches, when that doesn't really exist. What you tweeted is definitely, in our view, a more accurate representation of how, AQ operates vis-a-vis its general command and branches. The branches do support the goals and strategy of the leadership, but, they do have significant day-to-day autonomy. These are local groups operating in their local context. Al-Qaeda core, the general command is not going to tell them how to, Shabab, for instance, how to deal with a particular clan, when Shabab will know how to do that better. But the overarching goals of Shabab are in line with what the, general command tells them. And keep in mind that, Al-Qaeda's overall goal and original purpose is to foment and sustain these Islamic insurgencies. This is exactly what the branches are for. In the best place to really see this, which, you note, or, at least imply in the article, is Africa. You jump straight into their activities on the continent. You talk about Shabab in Somalia, you talk about JNIM in, the Sahel, and even AQ trying to mobilize supporters in Sudan. But, do you think you can discuss a little bit more about how you see the African branches and sort of what they contribute to, Al-Qaeda as a whole?
Sure. And I do agree, Al-Qaeda, its general command, just like, its branches, they all follow a set of steps and strategies of Al-Qaeda and goals of Al-Qaeda core. The main overarching goal is to, is establish an Islamic caliphate and, reminiscent of the times during, the Prophet Muhammad's times, way back in the, Islamic centuries and Islamic empires, which is, extends all over the North African countries, even a little bit of Spain, and, takes Afghanistan and all of that with it. But in order to get to that step and then expel, the Jews from Jerusalem and regain all the holy lands and, and all the holy shrines there. In order for them to get to that steps, they have an offensive and a defensive strategy, which they alternate and switch between. One, they conduct terrorist attacks against the U.S. and its allies and Israeli targets. And then at the same time, they want to overthrow Arab secular regimes. In order for them to overthrow Arab secular regimes, they need the affiliates to govern and provide services to the people there, which they can, win the hearts and minds of the population. So when the time is right and they can overthrow the government, the secular regimes, it's the affiliates that are localized in all of these countries are the ones that are conducting these goals and conducting that strategy. But at the end of the day, the overarching goal is establishing an Islamic caliphate, and all the affiliates work through that goal. I mean, even when bin Laden, when the alliance process occurred between Al-Qaeda core and all of its affiliates, bin Laden did the vetting process. He sent first Al-Qaeda leaders and members he trusted to those regions to assess what each affiliates needed, their strength, their weaknesses, what can they bring, and then to ensure that there's going to be synergy between the affiliates and there's going to be following the strategy of Al-Qaeda core and all of its goals. So especially right now in Africa, and as, and I mentioned earlier with Taliban needing recognition, which means like they're, withholding attacks at least from Afghanistan, but their operations and their planning continues there. Africa, with all of its coups and all of the Western withdrawal of the military, the French and all of that, we barely have, any more presence there on counterterrorism forces. It is going to be the next epicenter. And I do briefly mention on Sudan specifically, because I do think, Sudan will be the next Afghanistan. And the problem with that is Sudan's geostrategic location, its resources, its Islamic relevance, its ties to bin Laden that date back from the 1990s. And, even bin Laden, before he was killed in 2006 in an audio tape, he had said Sudan will be the next battlefield. So, and the resources Sudan has and how it links and connects the sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and with Khartoum as the capital in the middle as a headquarter, if it does become Afghanistan 2.0, and, Al-Qaeda has already been making moves there and have been calling for jihad there. And, the rapid support forces have ties to Al-Qaeda and they echo the same Islamic rhetoric. They echo the Sharia law. They echo all the violent tactics of Omar al-Bashir and then because they were former Janjaweed militia. It's going to be more dangerous than both how Afghanistan and Iraq combined were in that matter, because Sudan sits on all of our shipping and trade, maritime resources. Maritime attacks have been a huge rhetoric in bin Laden's propaganda right before he had died. They could literally, our economic sources would be hampered because all the oil shipping and all of that would occur there. So while, yes, you have a Shabab in different regions, Jainam, You have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and you have also like all the different like local groups of these affiliates. I mean, if you look at the maps right now, and we've seen also a cooperation between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in West Africa, and all the coups, and I mean, they're already spreading there and expanding. And as more African countries, start having more issues and geopolitical instabilities, and there are no military troops there and nothing to withstand and limit or, at least push back on Al-Qaeda's expansion and its activities there, it's going to be a mess when we see all the countries. And if you look at the map, I mean, it's like a domino effect of all Al-Qaeda's expansion and its activities and its propaganda and all of its movement. And it is, Africa, because it has the resources and it's known for, even as we move right now to like green energy, and you see like even, the Russia's there, China's there. We've seen a little bit of Iran also there, and, Wagner and Hezbollah. The whole continent is, it's a bomb ticking of complete jihadist takeover. If, there's not again, an intervention or anything there.
The denialists, they like to downplay, the actual links or connections between the branches and the general command. Again, this is what Tom Jocelyn calls disconnect the dots. It's making these assumptions or conscious, decisions to remove the evidence or to remove, any links between the affiliates and core. What would you say to those who dismiss these actual linkages and, ideological affinity between Al-Qaeda's general leadership and the African branches?
I mean, it's not even just the ideological affinity between the groups, because you can also, they can argue that side. They're like, the Islamic State has also similar ideological affinity with Al-Qaeda, but you don't see the alliance between Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State the way you see it with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and its branches. And, even when the first alliance started, after 9/11, when the group went into decentralization, it was the way bin Laden had strategized and had built the group is decentralization was the way to, avoid counterterrorism pressure. And because, when the core is just in Afghanistan, you're just going to target there. But when you have all the affiliates all over the place, it is going to be harder for, the US or the West to execute counterterrorism operations or pressure because they're so dispersed. Not only that fact, the way bin Laden had executed these alliances and had built the strategies and built the ties between the affiliates and the core, you don't see that within the Islamic State, which is why Al-Qaeda still remains, to me, a bigger threat than the Islamic State is. Because even, you look at, Al-Qaeda core and its affiliates, you can see how bin Laden not just only built, the alliances and, built the mergers. He, studied business administration at King Abdulaziz University. And I, went through all the syllabus and all the classes he had taken around, the time. And he was, reading, the books of, the fathers of the organizational studies. And he built the ties between even the affiliates themselves and the core, and between the affiliates, among themselves, horizontal and lateral ties. And you can see the way he established it, where AQAP would assist Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And then you can see Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula also help Al-Shabaab, because bin Laden had strict directions and guidance on, continue communicating, especially to AQAP, where we saw, Nasser al-Haishi at that point, how close he was with the core. And even, they want to deny the links. All the secession, strategies of Al-Qaeda's core were followed by Al-Qaeda leaders of the affiliates. It was, yes, sure, like in if we want to look like in following, bin Laden had lined up Al-Qaeda's leaders, affiliate leaders, as following in secession plans for them to become leaders, after each other. So that by itself tells you the ties are completely there, especially if you have, bin Laden or, Zawahiri or Al-Qaeda core's leaders, they put next, after they die, it's going to be, it was Al-Qaeda's, AQAP's leader, and then it was AQIM's leader, and then it was different leaders of these different affiliates, which that you can't deny that the ties are there. Not only that, but again, we've seen with the rise of the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda affiliates and Al-Qaeda core, even though during the rise and the peak of the Islamic State, where the Islamic State was the better partner, you didn't see an Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates were struggling around that time because of the counterterrorism pressure and all of that. You didn't see any of the affiliates go and, defect from Al-Qaeda and go to join the Islamic State, even though they had more money and they still had the same ideology. So the ties are there. And even if we look overarching picture of all the Al-Qaeda, branches, activities, and, their strategies, and even their shifts in strategies whenever Zawahiri comes up with a new guidance or a new strategy and, directs the affiliates like, do not target civilians, do not, or when bin Laden, during the Arab Spring, when bin Laden clearly instructed the affiliates, do not engage against, the governments, let them fight their own wars. We don't want to engage. And you can see the affiliates responding to that and acknowledging that and adapting to that. So if that doesn't tell you that the ties are there, I'm not sure what more evidence we need to, that can tell us that like they are, in line with Al-Qaeda's strategy. They do listen to, at the time bin Laden's command or Zawahiri's command or any shifts of strategy, which the organization publicly, and they're, publicly announced, the affiliates followed. And even right now with the announcement of the leader of, it's still, right now, it's presumably the de facto leader is Saif al-Adil, but we have not seen any of the affiliates even acknowledge Zawahiri's death. So you can see them acting in parallel and in concerted efforts. And even with the Israel-Hamas, war right now in the conflict, you saw all the branches make statements and launch, all like propaganda and all of that falls in line with the general command. It wasn't just it wasn't just the general command that went and celebrated Hamas's attack. It was the general command followed by AQAP, AQIM, Al-Shabaab, Hirath ad-Din, even in Syria. And that is a concerted effort that shows Al-Qaeda and its affiliates as a unified network acting in concert to Al-Qaeda's core and to the overarching tactics and all of that. And even, Saif al-Adil's new book, or, there's other books that got published. I mean, Al-Qaeda published a lot in the past 2 years, like books and that, details the steps to their operations, whether it was 9/11 or different books. They do say, going back to the autonomy that the affiliates have on the ground or all of that, from bin Laden's writings to the bin Laden documents to all the newest publications and books, they all echo that like the leadership will give overarching plans and it will give the autonomy for execution for its affiliates leaders. Because bin Laden had said, in letters between bin Laden and his associates and reading the declassified documents, you can notice how bin Laden does say like the people on the ground know best what to do on the ground because they have the situational understanding of what's happening there. They know what to do, but the goals are there. The plans are given by the central command, by the general command of Al-Qaeda, and it is up to the affiliates to execute in the way the affiliates see fit because they are the ones on the ground and they understand and know what is on the ground than, the core or any different leader. So it's been, they've been given autonomy to execute, but it's like, I do look at it, it's like centralized command, but decentralized, control, or vice versa, if you want to see it. And that's how Al-Qaeda had managed to continue to, even with its affiliates and its affiliates grow in money and members and territory, and they've sustained. It's because of those different strategies they've adapted, in response to our counterterrorism measures.
Right. I think you hit the nail on the head there, especially, two of these points that you brought up, I think, are the things that I like to mention to people that sort of deny sort of these links. And, the first thing is that, regional heads of Al-Qaeda, of being, the emirs and the Sahel, Somalia, wherever, they also sit on the Hatim Committee, the main shura for Al-Qaeda. If that doesn't show you that they are unified in a cohesive network, I don't know what does. Secondly, the line of secession. The UN noted a
Yeah.
year or two ago now that the regional heads are also in the overall line of secession. Abu Ubaidah and Shabab. I'm forgetting his name, but the AQIM leader is also
Yes.
within the top five. Abdelmalek Drukdal, when he was killed in Mali, the French
Yep.
noted that they assessed him to be the number 3 in line for Al-Qaeda as a whole. And then the last thing you touched on that I like to bring up is the cohesive media strategy, which I think a lot of people downplay, is that it's very easy to tell how cohesive they are by their media. And you absolutely nailed that, of the unified messaging they do, especially now with Gaza, but also the strategic silence they have on Saif al-Adil's appointment.
Yeah.
That shows you they've communicated with everyone to not mention this publicly. It's very clearly that everyone knows that it's safe. Everyone knows they have a leader. People like to bring up in articles or whatever of, well, they don't have a leader, they're in disarray. Like, they have a leader. They just haven't publicly announced it.
And they don't want to announce it because they don't want the U.S. to get, another Hellfire missile to kill the leader. They are trying to preserve the core and their leaders as much as possible right now, because they're trying to rebuild and re-strategize and continue to, teach the generations that are going to be next. And they need those, 9/11 veterans, and they need the core that were close to bin Laden so they can continue to echo his messaging and all of that. Plus, to go back to your point of the cohesive and, media strategy in line, when Zawahiri, during, I think, the 2014-2016 period, when he announced, when Al-Qaeda, I think it was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, had by mistake killed civilians, and that was where one of the affiliates deviated a little bit of what Zawahiri instructed. Zawahiri made the group, have a public apology of, that was not intentional and that was not, meant to be. So if, and that also shows you that public apology that, again, the affiliates are following and falling in line of what the general command is telling them and wants them to do.
Sarah, you'd mentioned the Al-Qaeda gives the guidance, the direction, and the affiliates or the branches, they carry them out. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I always look at it in terms of an imperfect analogy. But, the Department of Defense doesn't micromanage what CENTCOM does in its day-to-day operations or any other command. They give them the guidance, they give them the resources, CENTCOM understands what they need to do, and then they execute. Now, obviously, if it's a sensitive issue responding to an attack, they're going to go back up to the chain of command and how do we respond to this? But it's day-to-day operations. That's just not going to be the case. And on the issue of leadership, I couldn't agree more. And we have to remember Nasser al-Wahishi. I mean, this was before he was killed, 2015 or 16. I can't remember. It's so long ago. I mean, he was Al-Qaeda's third in command. He was their general manager. Al-Qaeda was decentralizing its leadership. And another reason, final quick thought, is that Al-Qaeda hasn't mentioned Zawahiri's death and announced a successor is because of where Zawahiri was killed and how he was killed is very embarrassing to both Al-Qaeda. Well, really embarrassing to the Taliban, not to Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda's covering for its ally. Al-Qaeda can't say that Zawahiri was killed in Kabul while sheltering with an associate of Sarajin Haqqani in a safe house they managed. So they're going to have to, play that game. I don't think Al-Qaeda's, it's a different, if this was 15 years ago, Al-Qaeda would have to announce its leadership. That was very important back then. I think things that you're talking about this and, how Al-Qaeda's evolved. It's not as important for Al-Qaeda today to have that public image, to be the face of so much has changed in the jihadist community, and Al-Qaeda has had a lot of success in integrating itself with local groups and managing its strategy. That the leader of Al-Qaeda today doesn't mean the same thing. I'm not saying it's not important, but announcing who it is and making that public isn't as important to them as it was, 10, 15 years ago.
100%. I completely agree. And just, to go back to Caleb's point, it's just, they are trying to, evade security measures and counterterrorism operations, and they don't, between them and among them, they know who the leader is, and they know, all of that, and they're, continue to get directions and strategies. But for them to announce it, that's not important for them anymore, because for them, it's security, it's secrecy right now. And that's how they preserve the element of surprise. And they keep, after 20 years of war, the war on terror and continuous pressure on Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, they don't want it back to shift to them right now. They want all eyes off of them, so they can, operate freely and, move freely and coordinate and do all of that. And when the time is right, they either, might not announce, but they will strike, they will surprise us, they will, which is why I, emphasized that the lack of visible activities does not mean that the group is gone and it's, is not operating just because they're not conducting as much attack or as many attacks as the Islamic State, or they're not making public appearances and, announcing everything publicly. It doesn't mean that they stopped existing and all of that. They've taken, we withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, and it's been, now 2 years. They are taking all of that time to rebuild, to reassess, to re-strategize, and they don't want any eyes on them right now or any, back pressure or any of that, because they're trying to reassess and rebuild so they can continue the plan that they, put up. But, even bin Laden, before he had died, he mentions how the strategies would shift, that, even he had instructed affiliates to not take media interviews, to not, everything that he was doing pre 9/11, he had told the affiliates, and even, between the letters and all of the, bin Laden documents, they mentioned that, we are not following the same strategies. We are going covert. We need to, avoid leadership decapitation and drone strikes. We cannot announce anymore. We cannot be in the public eye. Because again, like I've mentioned before in a Lawfare article back in April, Al-Qaeda conducts geopolitical assessments. I mean, if we look at bin Laden's diary during the Arab Spring, bin Laden followed it line by line. He was, apt to everything that was happening in order to assess how are all these geopolitical changes going to impact Al-Qaeda's strategy. And based on that, Al-Qaeda would re-strategize and then reshift and adapt to those, because for them being able to assess the situational understanding of all those regions was where would Al-Qaeda take advantages of that situation or exploit, vulnerabilities or all of that. So the group, adapts and continues, but it doesn't mean, again, that it stopped operating. It's just, they're trying to survive so they can, come back and surprise us when the time is right.
Yeah. And to your point about patience, first World Trade Center attack, 1993, 8 years in between. That certainly didn't mean Al-Qaeda wasn't relevant, wasn't working to 100%. Conduct another attack or anything quite like that. So let's take a look. You in your article, you focus towards the end on Saif al-Adil and his current leadership, or again, it's not officially confirmed, but we all know that it's there, that he's still the leader. Can you discuss how you see him as a leader and what he actually brings to the table for Al-Qaeda?
To be honest with you, I'm not completely convinced again that he is actually the one leading. I could say that yes, potentially he, the fact that he's in Iran and and I don't want to give Al-Qaeda too much credit on that, but for Al-Qaeda to make us believe that he is potentially the leader and him being in Iran, the U.S. can't really conduct, a drone strike right now in Iran or all of that. And in that way, they kind of, not announced it, but people presumed it was Saif al-Adil. Regardless if he is leading or not, he is playing some role within Al-Qaeda and its and the affiliates. And he did. There are different things, and we've had debates about his, who he is really, and the confusion that occurred before when we, way back when he was thought to be, a different commander or from a different country. But even Al-Qaeda's, books, the one that was published by Abu Muhammad al-Masri back in Iran, where I guess, he was Saif al-Adil around that time. The book mentions that, the U.S. has confused Saif al-Adil with someone else, and that Saif al-Adil actually is not the person that we make him to be and the role that he had played with Al-Qaeda. But he did, come from Egypt, and Egypt we know is like big for, for Zawahiri and for Al-Qaeda and, for, Islamic Jihad. He does play a role in, the military strategies. And we can see that from the new book that he's published, which is, he calls it like the free readings and his own take on the 33 strategies of war, which, inspired by Robert Greene's own book, where his strategy does indicate a slight shift on, whereas bin Laden back, in 2006, he said that they don't differentiate between civilian targets or the US as a government or the West or Israeli because they're both the same. But you can see from that book how Saif al-Adil mentions that, like, on our lands or our enemies' lands, do not target civilians. Do not, stray away from that, which also tells you, so are they now only targeting government and military? And, so is the targeting now shifted to just focusing on that? And if it is government, and military and all of those, what are the potential targets of those type of, targets? And then you can see the element of surprise is also still there, but also Saif al-Adil emphasizes, moving away from doing, conventional things and things that the branches or the members are used to, and continuously being creative and reflect and learn from the things that they, have done or have not done, or, and the group is known to learn from its mistakes and adapt. I mean, the World Trade Center was first in 1993, then they conducted 9/11 after that. So he does play, right now, a role in directing the military strategy and some of the guidance of the group in a way like, we are now trying to win more the hearts and minds. So do not conduct, attacks against civilians, which is also interesting, the timing of it, because, in the US, we saw on TikTok how there were, people who empathized and sympathized with bin Laden's letter, and which was, mind blowing to just see. But that again falls into the point of like winning the hearts and minds and avoiding the civilian targeting strategy, which is an interesting shift on that. But again, also Saif al-Adil seems to emphasize psychological warfare, where he says, we cannot just conduct one attack because we need the psychological ramifications to be more. So he also advises and guides for consecutive attacks right after each other to, to bring out the psychological aspects of it. So he kind of calls for, it's the same kind of 9/11 operations where you saw multiple planes, going into multiple different places at the same time. And there's been, an echo of that. But again, it doesn't, even within their newest 9/11 anniversary magazine, they say, planes aren't the only thing that you can use. And, and the consecutive attacks don't mean just in the United States. I mean, we've seen them echo, new threats, again, renewed threats to European countries and, NATO allies. So, this is also the type of, publishing propaganda or publishing books is also the way of how, the affiliates may be communicating, the guidance, the type of even if you look at the different books, all the books have advice from these type of leaders, things that you have to do, books by what Zawahiri did, or Anwar al-Awlaki, or all the different things. And those propaganda isn't just for us to read and see, but it is an easier way to communicate and to avoid being caught. And especially right now, you can see them, even all the core and the affiliates publish statements about what is the best platform to communicate on, or VPNs and all of these things. So, and if that also, doesn't show that the group is adapting to even technological advancement and is, coordinating, even that they're not really coordinating, I'm not sure what more evidence do we want. And, even to go back, not just the strategy. And I do think, just like I, mentioned in that tweet that Caleb mentioned about that strategy and adaptability are more important factors than material resources for these groups, because we've seen them, we've seen how 9/11 was clearly demonstrated the strategic acumen. We've also seen a lot of research and a lot of, even right now with, Ukraine's resistance to Russia, Russia's more materially superior. But again, it's strategy, it's adaptability, it's all of these things. And I, after 20 years and, and the war on terror, I'm just hoping that we're able to recognize that we cannot just look for numbers, because if we learned anything from those past 20 years about relying on tangible capabilities or looking for data or statistics or numbers, it was, time over time over time, we've been proven it's not the numbers. It's not the quantities that matter. It's not any of these things. And we should be vigilant to more than the numbers. And like you said, the debate about if Al-Qaeda, when the administration rejected UN's report, there was an article that, got published about the debate about Al-Qaeda's presence or threat or all of that. And, multiple government officials have made statements like, oh, but I don't see the data and I don't see the numbers. And it's just like, but we've done this before. Pre 9/11, Al-Qaeda barely had between 50 and 75 members. The 9/11 operation in its entirety that killed 3,000 U.S., Americans, and then all the wars that we've been, dragged in afterwards, it didn't cost much. So it's, it's just the sounding the alarm that, you and Caleb continue to do. It's just, I hope we can continue just to be vigilant so we're not surprised again. Right.
Just absolutely nailing it. Like, it is so refreshing to hear someone, who thinks this way. I can't stress that enough. But one last thing, super brief, before we sort of wrap this up. But part of your article, you talk about the war in Gaza, and you sort of make the case that it's acting as a galvanizing moment for AQ. And to note, AQ has always placed itself within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even though they've have limited to no presence there. But various branches have used that conflict to justify acts of terror. But can you speak to more about what you mean by that and sort of what the evidence is to suggest that it is a galvanizing moment for AQ?
To be honest, yes, the Palestinian cause has always been what Al-Qaeda has used, even, from when bin Laden had put the strategy and the goals for Al-Qaeda. And even he had even an interview, bin Laden had stated and attributed 9/11 to, the US's support to Israel and all the Israeli tension that was happening before, around the times of 9/11. And, and the overarching goal continues to be to expel the Jews from, Palestine and regain and reclaim Palestine. How I see it galvanizing even more is the fact that now we're seeing, more recruitment because of the Israeli, Hamas war. We're seeing a lot of more jihadist rhetoric. We're seeing more anti-Israeli, anti-American sentiments rise from, all over the world. And Al-Qaeda capitalizes on that, just like it capitalized on, on a lot of the conflicts before. And that drives this recruitment. That gives members and people and individuals all over the world a reason to join Al-Qaeda and to sympathize with Al-Qaeda's cause. And even not only just that, we've also seen, how alliances occur against common adversaries and foes. And even though they're temporarily and, they're transactional in a sense, we've seen in the past how Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State cooperated in West Africa. We've seen, even bin Laden around the time, he always wanted to reunite, all the Islamist group. And that goes back, again, to the Prophet Muhammad's time, where he also wanted to, have all the Muslims, under one banner. But again, that gives also, you can see the rhetoric of all the different, terrorist groups and Al-Qaeda and its branches, Islamic State, even Hezbollah in a matter, about how they're all calling for the same thing. You can see more support. You can see less attacking each other on their propaganda. You can see a type of unity that, even though it's temporarily, if the enemy is common, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we can see that rhetoric, which also means the conflict will galvanize, maybe, terrorist groups joining hands in hands. And that also means more resources. That means more attacks on different fronts for the U.S. and its, and Israel. So you can see also, more propaganda even getting published right now on regarding, with the hashtag with Al-Aqsa floods and how that hashtag is being used not just by terrorist groups, but by individuals, just like you and I, who are sympathizing with the Palestinians and the conflict in Gaza. So it is galvanizing, and it's also, the eyes are there. So we're not seeing any pressure on Al-Qaeda or its affiliates. And, you mentioned that they don't have a group there. There has been, the Lion's Den in Nablus, that, the group that rose and suddenly took, everyone by surprise. There are links of that group to Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden he had a training camp that was called the Masada during the Soviet times, and it was called the Lion's Den, where he put it strategically within the Soviets so you can attack the enemy right in the head. And if you look at how the propaganda of this group is built and is organized, the ties, the rhetoric, it all echoes Bin Laden's statements. The rhetoric, the alliances, the type of all of that. And then if you look at the time that group rose, the group rose right after we withdrew from Afghanistan. And one of the Bin Laden letters between him and his associate says, to expel the Jews from Palestine is to claim victory in Afghanistan. We withdrew, the group rose in September 4th. And with the propaganda that is strong, that is surprising. So, Al-Qaeda might have a group there. It's just has not announced it, at least, or made that link very clear.
Right. I mean, I don't know about the Lion's Den, just to provide a contrarian take to that. Just, our colleague Joe Trusman does a lot on the West Bank. A lot of what his reporting is, it's more, PIJ, Hamas, but, nebulous ties to, whoever else could be. But for now, it seems more of the more mainline resistance factions. But, just on this topic real quick before we close of, I don't know if it's still around, but there was, I think it was like Jaish al-Umma in Gaza. That was sort of like the AQ group nominally, but doesn't seem like they've been participating in this current round, which is interesting.
I mean, again, it could be strategic patience and, tactical pause, just like we've, mentioned.
Or they could be, and they're just not saying it.
100%. So, that goes back to how Bin Laden instructed the affiliates during the Arab Spring to not engage, because because he wanted, the government and whoever is involved to just drain the resources themselves without having, any loss on its affiliates or its resources or members. So also that could be that strategy as well. And, or there's a different plan that's set for, for them around a specific time or,
Sara astutely ends her article at The War on the Rocks with, for Al-Qaeda, it is a marathon, not a sprint. So Al-Qaeda's adaptability, its strategic thinking, its willingness to work with others, unlike the Islamic State, and its patience is what leads me to assess Al-Qaeda to be a far more dangerous and a strategic enemy than the Islamic State. I know a lot of people will disagree with that, but I will stand by that. Sara, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This was insanely helpful and insightful. We greatly appreciate your perspective on this issue, and we're happy to share it with our listeners. We look forward to following your work and hopefully having you back on the podcast more often in the future. Best of luck to you and best of luck with your work. And again, my sincerest thanks. I know I could speak for Caleb as well. Our sincerest thanks for joining us today on Generation Jihad.
Of course. Thank you so much, Caleb and Bill, for having me. And I look forward to, more podcasts together in the future and more cooperative projects and work together to continue to echo this threat to, so we're vigilant and we're not complacent.
Yes, they need to hear your voice, Sara. Caleb and I and Tom, we've been beating this drum for years, and I think we get tuned out at some point. We get accused of being the broken record, but you're definitely a fresh voice on this with an interesting perspective, and we greatly appreciate it. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.